In order for muscle contraction to occur, we need to have ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that high energy molecule that provides the energy for almost everything that our cell does. We need ATP for several different things in the course of muscle contraction. First, we have to have ATP to bind to the myosin so that it will release actin and so that it can do that reach out step before it grabs the actin to pull again. We also need ATP in order to pump the calcium from the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum following a contraction. And finally, we have to have plenty of ATP available for the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. Without the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, we can't maintain the proper concentrations of sodium and potassium and inside and outside of the cell for the membrane potential, so we can't excite the cell and we can't have a contraction. So ATP is really important. The main mechanism for making ATP in our muscle cells is aerobic respiration. In the process of aerobic respiration, we use mitochondria in the cells to take glucose and oxygen and convert that into ATP, making the byproducts water and CO2 as well. This particular reaction is one that I want you to know. The fact that we start with 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. The mitochondria can take that and convert that into 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and a whole lot of ATP. By a whole lot, I mean we can make about 30 molecules of ATP this way, so we can get a lot of energy out of 1 glucose molecule. Your muscle cells are really well developed for being able to carry out aerobic respiration. They have mitochondria in them, and they also have a store of glucose. Your muscle cells store glucose in the form of glycogen. Remember way back in the chemistry unit when we talked about glycogen being a stored form of glucose? That's how our muscle cells are storing glucose so that they have plenty of it available for aerobic respiration. We also have plenty of oxygen that's stored in muscle cells. There's a special molecule inside your muscle cells called myoglobin that binds to oxygen and stores it to be used later. So we have a lot of myoglobin inside the muscles to store oxygen. So between the glucose stored as glycogen, the oxygen on the myoglobin, and the mitochondria, your cells have everything they need to carry out aerobic respiration to make lots of ATP. This works great most of the time, but we run into trouble when you engage in some sort of sudden, intense activity. There's really only enough stored ATP and oxygen in your muscle cells for just a few seconds of sudden, intense activity. If you're just going for a walk, it's not a problem, but if you suddenly decide that you're going to sprint as fast as you can down the block, you only have a few seconds worth of energy for that sort of intense movement. In that case, we run out of the oxygen that we would need for aerobic respiration, and we have to use a different mechanism of ATP production. In that case, your muscle cells will switch to something called the phosphagen system in order to make ATP for muscle contraction. In the phosphagen system, we steal a phosphate from a different molecule and hook it onto ADP to make ATP. The molecule that we typically are stealing from is a molecule called creatine phosphate. We can take the phosphate group off creatine phosphate and hook it onto an ADP, that's adenosine diphosphate, that has just 2 phosphate groups, add that 3rd phosphate group that we just stole off the creatine phosphate, and suddenly we have ATP. You have enough creatine phosphate and enough similar phosphagen system molecules for about 5 to 10 seconds of intense activity using ATP generated from the phosphagen system. If your intense burst of activity is going to last much longer than that, we have to switch to yet a different mechanism of ATP production. That 3rd mechanism of ATP production is called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic means without oxygen. So this is a way that we can make ATP without using any oxygen. The type of anaerobic respiration that our muscle cells are able to use is called lactic acid fermentation. We start with the glucose, just like we would for aerobic respiration. Only we don't use the mitochondria, and since we don't have oxygen, we don't use that either. And instead, we convert this one molecule of glucose into 2 molecules of lactic acid. When we do this, we gain 2 molecules of ATP. So we manage to make a little bit of ATP, which is what we're going for. However, if we compare, when we're using aerobic respiration, that one glucose gives us 30 molecules of ATP. But when we're using anaerobic respiration, 1 molecule of glucose only gives us 2 molecules of ATP. So it's definitely not the most efficient way to make ATP. But once we run out of oxygen, it will give us enough energy for about 30 to 40 seconds of intense activity. Usually by that point, we're able to increase the heart rate, increase the blood pressure, get more circulation going to the muscles, and help to supply an increased demand of oxygen so that you can mostly switch back to aerobic respiration at that point. After any sort of prolonged activity like that, where we've actually used up all of the oxygen stores available, we have what's called an oxygen debt. The oxygen debt is the extra amount of oxygen you need to recover from that sort of intense activity. That increased level of oxygen is needed for a number of different things. For one, we need to use aerobic respiration to synthesize our resting levels of ATP again. If you're doing prolonged activity, you're using up almost all of the stored ATP in your cells. You need to build that store back up. Second, you need to build back up your stores of oxygen on myoglobin. During prolonged activity, you use almost all your stored oxygen from myoglobin, and we need some extra oxygen to replace that so that we've got it available for next time. We also need extra oxygen to get rid of the lactic acid. Lactic acid collects in the muscles during intense or prolonged activity, and then through the normal circulation of the blood, the lactic acid comes out of the muscles and ends up in the liver. In the liver, we can convert that lactic acid back into glucose, but it does take oxygen. Finally, any sort of prolonged activity is going to raise the metabolic rate. It's going to raise the rate at which all of your cells are doing their jobs and using energy. And that's going to require extra oxygen to sustain. So the increase in the metabolic rate will use more oxygen, so you have an increased need for oxygen after activity, usually for some hours.